Today, we are covering the logic of elections. We will cover the logic of elections, the right to vote, and who uses the right to vote. First, let's discuss some recent elections in American history. The public sent very different messages in federal elections in 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2014. In 2008, the public moved away from the Republican Party and embraced hope and change with the Democratic Party nominee, Barack Obama. In 2010, the rise of the Tea Party symbolized the public rejection of government spending and some of the Democratic Party agenda. Nonetheless, the 2012 election resulted in an embrace of the status quo, with President Barack Obama winning his re-election campaign against Republican nominee Mitt Romney. Election 2014 again showed some public resistance to the Democratic Party agenda. The 2008 election was the first election since 1952 where no sitting president or vice president was running. The election season was particularly exciting due to lively primary campaigns in both parties. Barack Obama became the first black candidate for a major party in the US. John McCain became the oldest first-time nominee for president. Election 2016, with the first female nominee from a major party, Hillary Clinton, and a wealthy businessman with no electoral experience, Donald Trump, running, this election season is in some ways more interesting than 2008. Different countries have different electoral systems, but there is some logic behind all of them. The US is a republic, which is a form of democracy where citizens delegate the work of government to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. A pure democracy system, a pure direct democracy system, is out of the question given the large size of the US. We simply cannot spend the time and the resources educating every citizen on every issue efficiently enough for everyone to vote on every policy. Also, there is no guarantee that what is popular is necessarily the most effective policy. Instead, we put our faith in others and risk that they may put some of their own interests ahead of the greater good. Elections solve a delegation problem. Ordinary citizens are able to pick who represents them. The prospect of future elections gives office holders who want to keep their jobs a motive to be responsive agents. Elections provide powerful incentives for a small set of citizens who want to replace the current office holders to keep a close eye on representatives and to tell everyone else about any misconduct they detect. The right to vote has changed throughout the history of the US. During the founding, every colony imposed some property qualification for voting. Some had other requirements related to religion, and none allowed women to vote. Wider suffrage for men came during the Revolutionary War, as no taxation without representation implied that everyone who paid taxes should have the right to vote. Also, men risked their lives for independence and felt entitled to full political citizenship regardless of wealth. Finally, the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal. Suffrage for women came with increased access in education for both sexes, entry of women into the workforce outside the home, and the political need to expand the vote to women. Western territories were the first to grant women the right to vote, not because they were radicals, but because votes from women were thought to uphold family values. Of course, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave all women of voting age the right to vote. As we covered during the section on civil rights, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave African Americans the right to vote. In 1971, the 26th Amendment made the voting age 18 instead of 21. This change was provoked by the Vietnam War, where young men were drafted to fight but didn't have the right to vote. This was in 1971. It makes sense that people insist on the right to vote in order to give leaders a reason to care about the opinions of the public. It also makes sense not to bother voting because of the likelihood that any single vote will influence an election outcome is extremely small. This leads us to ask the question, why do so many Americans forego free riding and decide to vote? It makes sense to remain ignorant, so why study up on issues if your vote doesn't really matter? Only 58% of the eligible electorate bothered to vote in 2012. Research shows that several individual factors affect turnout. These factors include age, education, roots in the community, and partisanship. Older people are more likely to vote than younger people. People with higher levels of education are more likely to vote than people with lower levels of education. People with deeper roots in their communities are more likely to vote than people who move a lot. People who are more partisan are more likely to vote than people who are less partisan. One famous scholar, Anthony Downs, came up with the calculus of voting. He said that the decision to vote depends on the probability that an individual's vote will determine the outcome multiplied by the potential benefit of the election outcome to that individual minus the cost of voting. Since the chance of influencing the election outcome is so slim, the result is an equation that shows that it is impractical for anyone to vote. The cost of driving to the polls or taking time off work to vote is almost always higher than the probability of influencing the election outcome and the potential benefit. Later, scholars added the D term to help explain why people do vote. The D term represents a person's sense of duty to vote. The sense of duty and the belief that voting is the right thing to do compels citizens to vote even though their vote probably won't influence the outcome. There are also institutional factors that affect turnout. Variations in voter registration can affect turnout in each state. Voter ID laws create a barrier that may prevent some people from voting. Proponents of voter ID laws argue that they prevent voter fraud. Opponents of voter ID laws argue that they are created to keep certain groups of citizens from voting. Social pressures also impact voter turnout. Something as simple as seeing a coworker wearing an I voted sticker can pressure others into going to the polls. Personal appeal can increase voter turnout. Friends, family, or neighbors may encourage people to vote. Interestingly, easier voter registration laws and increased educational attainment did not raise turnout as would be expected from the 1960s through the 1980s. The expected increase was offset by an increasingly young electorate following the passage of the 26th Amendment. Voters decide on who to vote for in several ways. Some use past performance and incumbency to make a choice. Voters look at the performance of incumbents. Presidents, especially, are often judged by the performance of the economy. Things like unemployment, inflation rates, and measures of economic growth act as indicators of how the incumbent president is doing. Some assess some voters assess issues and policy options. Many look at their own lives as it relates to issues. For example, senior citizens may judge the health of the economy and the performance of the incumbent by paying attention to the size of their Social Security checks. Single issue voters cast their votes based on a single issue that is very important to them, such as abortion or gun rights. The graphic presented on the right shows a popular graph of private sector job growth under Bush and Obama. This graph was a popular tool used by Obama supporters to argue that the incumbent, Obama, was doing a good job. Opponents used other economic indicators to make the argument that he and his administration were not doing a good job. Voters also use cues and shortcuts to cast their vote. They take cues from opinion leaders, which was covered in the chapter on public opinion. Voters also use personal criteria, which are important because not every issue that a president faces can be fully anticipated, and therefore personal characteristics, such as honesty, are important. Voters use party label as a cue to give them some idea of how a candidate stands on issues, even if they do not know for sure all of the issue positions of the candidate. Party identification is the best single indicator of vote choice. Next week, we will continue covering voting, campaigns, and elections.